It was a cold October night, one of those nights where the wind howls like a wolf and the leaves scatter in frantic little dances across the empty streets. I remember every detail like it happened yesterday. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of the night I encountered something I can't explain, something that changed me forever. I had just finished my shift at the diner and was walking home. My town, a quiet, small place in the Midwest, didn't have much crime, and I'd always felt safe, even in the dead of night. The police patrolled often, and everyone knew everyone. But that night, the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. As I walked, I noticed a police car parked at the edge of an old cemetery that bordered the town. Its lights weren't flashing, and it seemed out of place. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to approach it. After all, police officers were supposed to protect us, right? Maybe they needed help, or maybe they'd seen something suspicious. The window was down slightly, and I called out, "Officer, is everything okay?" No response. I stepped closer, peering into the car. My stomach dropped. The officer was sitting in the driver's seat, his face pale and frozen in an expression of sheer terror. His hands were clutching the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. His lips were slightly parted, and his eyes looked like they'd seen something not of this world. "Officer?" I said again, my voice trembling. Still nothing. I reached out and gently tapped the door, trying not to panic. That's when I noticed the radio. It was crackling with static, but beneath the static was something else. A voice, whispering, low and guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. My instinct told me to run, but I couldn't leave him like that. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered immediately. 911, what's your emergency? I'm at the old cemetery, I stammered. There's a police car here, and the officer, he's not responding. He looks like he's in shock or something. The operator paused for a moment, then said something that made my blood run cold. "Ma'am, are you sure? We don't have any officers assigned to that area tonight." I froze. "But I'm looking at one right now. The car's here, and the officer is inside." "Stay on the line," she said. "We're sending someone to your location. Please do not approach the vehicle any further." I didn't listen. Something about the situation compelled me to act, even though every instinct screamed for me to leave. I opened the car door. The officer didn't move. He didn't even blink. That's when I saw the blood. A thin trickle of it was running from his ears and down his neck, staining the collar of his uniform. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was closing up. Then the smell hit me, a mix of decay and something sulfuric, like burnt matches. The radio crackled again, louder this time. The whispers were clearer, and I could make out a single phrase repeated over and over. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" Suddenly, the officer's head snapped toward me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I swear they weren't human anymore. They were pitch black, like two endless voids. His mouth moved, but the words that came out weren't his own. It was the same guttural voice from the radio. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled back, nearly falling as the wind picked up around me, howling louder than before. The temperature dropped so sharply that my breath came out in visible puffs. The cemetery gates creaked open on their own, and from the corner of my eye, I saw shadows moving, long, spindly shapes darting between the headstones. The officer stepped out of the car, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by an unseen hand. He pointed to the cemetery, his finger trembling. "Go," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're waiting." Before I could respond, another police car pulled up, its sirens blaring. Two officers jumped out, weapons drawn. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," one of them shouted. I turned to look at the first officer, but he was gone. The car was empty, the driver's seat completely clean, no blood doubt, no sign anyone had been there at all. The officers approached me cautiously, their eyes darting to the cemetery. "What happened here?" one of them asked. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. They didn't believe me. How could they? There was no evidence, no proof, except for the whispers still coming from the first car's radio. One of the officers reached in to turn it off, but the moment he touched it, he recoiled like he'd been burned. His partner swore under his breath and grabbed his arm, which now had a blistered handprint on it. "Let's get out of here," the second officer said. "Now." They escorted me to their car and drove me home. They didn't say much, but I could see the fear in their eyes. Before they left, one of them handed me his card. "If you remember anything else," he said, "call me." I never did, but I couldn't forget. Over the next few days, I tried to move on, but strange things kept happening. My phone would ring at odd hours, and when I answered, all I'd hear was static and faint whispers. Objects in my house would move on their own, and at night, I'd see shadows darting across my walls. The worst part? I started having dreams. Dreams of the cemetery, of the officer's black eyes, and of something lurking in the darkness. Something ancient and angry. I eventually moved away, but even now, I can't shake the feeling that it followed me, that it's still watching, waiting for the right moment. I don't walk alone at night anymore. I don't go near cemeteries, and I never, ever approach parked police cars.
Story number 2.
It was around midnight when I got the call. I'd been asleep, but the buzzing of my phone jolted me awake. My best friend, Danny, was on the line, his voice trembling with panic. "Sarah, I need your help," he whispered, his words barely audible over the sound of heavy breathing. "Danny, what's going on?" I asked, sitting up in bed, already feeling a knot forming in my stomach. "There's something outside my house," he said. "Something wrong. I think it's watching me." Danny lived out in the country, far from any neighbors or busy streets. It wasn't unusual for wild animals to wander onto his property, but the fear in his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from him before. "Did you call the police?" I asked. "I did," he replied. "They said they're sending someone, but it's been 20 minutes. Sarah, I don't think they're coming." Something in his tone made my blood run cold. "Stay inside," I said, grabbing my keys. "I'm coming over." The drive to Danny's house felt like an eternity. The roads were pitch black, illuminated only by the narrow beams of my headlights. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind pushed through the trees. When I arrived, I saw his house bathed in the glow of his porch light. His curtains were drawn, and I could see his silhouette standing by the window. I parked and hurried to the front door, knocking urgently. Danny opened it almost immediately, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Thank God you're here," he said, pulling me inside and locking the door behind me. "What's going on?" I asked, looking around the room. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. "I don't know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I heard something outside, like footsteps, but heavier, like someone dragging something. I thought it might be an animal, but when I looked, I saw... I don't even know how to describe it." "What did you see?" I pressed. His eyes darted toward the window. "It was tall, too tall to be human. Its limbs were all wrong, like they were bent in places they shouldn't be. And its face," he shuddered. "It didn't have one." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you sure you weren't imagining things?" "I know what I saw," he said firmly, "and it wasn't human." I glanced toward the window, my curiosity warring with my fear. "Did you hear anything else?" "Not since I called you," he said, "but I keep feeling like it's still out there, watching." Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the side of the house. Both of us froze. The sound came again, harder this time, like something was slamming against the wall. Danny grabbed a flashlight and motioned for me to follow him. We moved cautiously through the house, checking each window. Outside, the darkness seemed to press against the glass, thick and impenetrable. At the back of the house, we found the source of the noise. A large, deep dent marred the siding, as if something heavy had struck it repeatedly. Nearby, in the dirt, were massive footprints, far too large to belong to any person or animal. "What the hell?" Danny whispered, his voice shaking. Before I could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights flashed as a patrol car pulled up to the house. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions of irritation and concern. "Someone called about a disturbance?" one of them asked, shining his flashlight toward us. "Yes," Danny said, relief flooding his face. "Thank God you're here. There's something out here. It attacked my house." The officers exchanged a skeptical glance. "An animal, maybe?" one suggested. Danny said, his voice rising. "It's not an animal, I don't know what it is, but it's not normal." The second officer sighed. "We'll take a look around." The 2 of them split up, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they walked the perimeter of the property. Danny and I stayed on the porch, watching nervously. A few minutes later, we heard one of the officers shout. The beam of his flashlight jerked wildly before going out completely. The second officer ran toward the sound, drawing his weapon. "Stay here," I told Danny, and before he could stop me, I followed the officer into the darkness. I found him near the edge of the woods, his flashlight flickering as he scanned the area. "Where's your partner?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to something on the ground. I stepped closer and saw deep gouges in the dirt, as if something with claws had dragged itself, or something else into the forest. "What did this?" I asked, but he just shook his head, his grip tightening on his gun. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the trees and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. The officer turned toward the sound, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Show yourself," he shouted. The growl grew louder, and then from the shadows it emerged. The thing was even worse than Danny had described. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its limbs grotesquely elongated, its skin pale and stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its face was a blank expanse, save for a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. The officer fired, but the bullets seemed to pass through the creature without effect. It lunged at him, moving with inhuman speed. I turned and ran, my heart pounding as I heard his screams echo behind me. When I reached the house, Danny was waiting at the door, his face ashen. "What happened?" he demanded. "It's real," I gasped. "We need to get out of here. Now." We jumped into my car and sped away, leaving the house and whatever was stalking it behind. As we drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature chasing us. But the road was empty. We never found out what happened to the officers. Their car was still parked outside Danny's house the next day, but they were gone, along with any trace of the creature. The gouges in the dirt and the dents in the house were the only evidence that something terrible had happened. Danny sold the house and moved to the city, hoping to escape whatever had haunted him. But even now, years later, I still feel like it's not over. Sometimes late at night, I'll hear footsteps outside my window, heavy and deliberate, like something is waiting, watching. And I know one thing for sure, whatever it is, it's not done with us yet.
Story number 3.
I don't know why I stayed so late that night. I guess I thought finishing the last batch of paperwork would mean one less headache in the morning. It was a Tuesday, a slow day at the precinct, but the kind of slow that makes the place feel eerie. You know, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint clatter of a typewriter from an old desk no one uses anymore. I worked at a police station in a small southern town, the kind where nothing ever happened. At least, that's what we told ourselves. But that night, I realized some places keep their secrets buried deep, and some secrets refuse to stay that way. Around midnight, the phone rang. Not the main line. This was the old rotary phone in the corner of the room, the one we kept for emergencies when the power went out. Nobody ever used it. I stared at it for a moment, half expecting it to stop, but it didn't. Reluctantly, I picked it up. Central Station. Officer Daniels speaking. At first, there was nothing, just static. Then a faint voice broke through. "They're here. You need to come." It was a man's voice, trembling and low, like he was trying not to be heard. "Sir, who's there? What's your location?" I asked, already grabbing my notepad. "They're outside the window," he whispered. "Don't let them in. Whatever you do, don't." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hands still gripping the receiver. Something about his voice sent a chill down my spine. I traced the call to an address about 10 miles out of town. It was an old farmhouse we'd gotten complaints about before. Trespassers, strange noises, things like that. I grabbed my jacket, radioed the dispatcher to let them know where I was heading, and drove out. The road was empty. The kind of empty that makes you feel like you're the last person alive. My headlights carved through the darkness, and the trees lining the road seemed to close in the farther I drove. When I reached the farmhouse, the place looked abandoned. The windows were dark, and the porch sagged like it had been holding its breath for years. I parked, stepped out, and immediately felt the air change. It was colder here, unnaturally so, and the silence was oppressive. I knocked on the door. "This is Officer Daniels. Is anyone home?" No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. The wood beneath my hand felt damp, almost slick, like it had been left out in the rain, though the ground was dry. I tried the door, and it creaked open, revealing a long hallway that stretched into darkness. "Hello?" I called out, stepping inside. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the faint smell of decay hit me like a wave, the kind of smell that gets into your clothes, your skin, and stays with you long after you've left. I walked through the house, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The living room was empty, though the furniture was still there, covered in a thick layer of dust. A broken clock on the mantel ticked faintly, though its hands hadn't moved in years. I found the phone in the kitchen. It was off the hook, swinging gently as if someone had just hung up. Beside it, on the floor, were footprints. Bare, muddy, and far too large for any human. My chest tightened. Something wasn't right. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut before I could reach it. The sound echoed through the house, followed by a low, guttural noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The noise stopped. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something darted past the hallway, too quick for me to get a good look, but it was tall, taller than any person should be. I backed into the living room, my hand on my gun. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath now, forming clouds in the beam of my flashlight. That's when I heard it, whispering. Faint, almost imperceptible, like voices carried on the wind. They were coming from the walls. I pressed my ear to the nearest one, and the whispers grew louder. It wasn't just one voice, it was dozens, all speaking at once, overlapping and frantic. Then, clear as day, one voice broke through the chaos. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted for the door, but the hallway seemed longer now, stretching out impossibly far. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more urgent, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were screams. I reached the front door and yanked it open, stumbling outside. The air felt thick, like I was moving through water, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift with every step. I made it to my car and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the keys as the porch light flickered erratically. That's when I saw them. They were standing in the field beyond the house. Dozens of them. Their silhouettes tall and thin, their limbs too long and their heads tilted unnaturally to the side. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched. I started the car and peeled out of there, my tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the road. I didn't look back, not until I was back at the station, sitting in the parking lot with my heart racing and my hands shaking. The dispatcher looked up when I walked in. "Back already?" she asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat down and tried to collect myself. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, that it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something on my desk, a single muddy footprint. I left the station that night and never went back. I moved to a different town, a different state, trying to put as much distance as I could between myself and that place. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, and I know they're still out there, waiting.
Story number 4.
I was a rookie officer just a few weeks into my first assignment in a small rural town. The place was quiet, too quiet, some might say. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, and the most exciting thing to happen was the occasional missing livestock. It was a crisp November evening when the call came in. Dispatch said a woman had reported hearing screams from the abandoned asylum at the edge of town. The asylum, Ashwood Institute, had been shuttered for decades, left to decay under a blanket of local rumors and ghost stories. The townsfolk avoided it like the plague, swearing it was cursed. I was paired with Officer Thompson that night, a grizzled veteran with years on the force. He chuckled when we got the call. "Kids," he said, shaking his head. "Probably messing around again." The drive out to the asylum was unsettling. The road was narrow, flanked by dense trees that seemed to close in as we approached. By the time the crumbling silhouette of Ashwood loomed into view, the moon had disappeared behind a thick layer of clouds, leaving the world in near total darkness. We parked near the rusted gate, its padlock long gone. The wind carried a faint, metallic creak as the gate swung back and forth, though the air was still. Thompson grabbed his flashlight and gestured for me to follow. "Stay close," he said. "These old places aren't as empty as they seem." The asylum was massive, its once grand architecture now reduced to shattered windows and ivy-covered walls. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something else, something sharp and sour, like spoiled meat. Our flashlights barely pierced the darkness as we walked through the main hall. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, and papers so old they crumbled at a touch. Every step echoed unnaturally, as if the building itself was alive and listening. "Dispatch said they heard screams," I said, my voice low. "Doesn't sound like kids messing around." Thompson nodded but didn't respond. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a focused, almost grim expression. We checked the first floor, finding nothing but shadows and silence. Then we heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound, like a child's giggle. It came from somewhere above us, echoing down the crumbling staircase. "Stay here," Thompson ordered. "I'll check it out." "Not a chance," I said, gripping my flashlight tighter. "I'm coming with you." He sighed, but didn't argue. Together we climbed the stairs, each step groaning under our weight. The sound grew louder as we ascended, but it wasn't giggling anymore. It was crying, a soft, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We reached the second floor, our flashlights sweeping over the peeling wallpaper and cracked tiles. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. Then, from the end of the hallway, a door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Thompson and I exchanged a glance, his jaw tightening. "Stay close," he muttered again, leading the way toward the door. When we reached it, he pushed it open with his foot, his flashlight illuminating the room beyond. It was empty, just an old examination room with rusted medical equipment and a gurney tipped on its side. But the air felt wrong, heavy and electric, like a storm was brewing indoors. "Hello?" Thompson called out. "This is the police. Is anyone here?" The only response was the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and coming from above us. We both looked up, our flashlights revealing the rotting ceiling. Dust rained down as the footsteps grew louder, pacing back and forth directly over our heads. "We're not alone," I whispered. Thompson nodded, his hand moving to the grip of his holstered gun. "Third floor. Let's go." We made our way to the next staircase, the footsteps above us never stopping. The higher we climbed, the colder it got. By the time we reached the third floor, I could see my breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with doors that hung ajar. The air was filled with a faint, rhythmic tapping like nails against glass. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to move, shifting from one direction to another. "Check the rooms," Thompson said. "I'll cover you." I nodded and pushed open the nearest door. The room was empty except for a single wheelchair, its wheels spinning slowly, though there was no draft. My heart pounded as I backed out and moved to the next door. As I opened it, I froze. In the corner of the room, crouched in the shadows, was a figure. It was small, hunched over, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Its head jerked up at the sound of the door, revealing a face that wasn't human. Its eyes were black pits, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, filled with jagged teeth. It laughed, a shrill, piercing sound that sent ice through my veins, and then it lunged. I screamed, stumbling backward into the hallway. Thompson was at my side in an instant, like his flashlight slicing through the darkness, but the figure was gone. "What the hell was that?" I gasped. Thompson didn't answer. His face was pale, his eyes scanning the hallway with a new intensity. "We're leaving," he said, his voice firm. "Now." We turned and started back toward the staircase, but the building had changed. The hallway seemed longer, stretching into an endless void. The tapping sound grew louder, now accompanied by whispers. Dozens of voices, overlapping and frantic. I felt something brush against my arm, cold and clammy. But when I looked, there was nothing there. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces in the walls. Pale, distorted faces with hollow eyes, watching us. "Move!" Thompson barked, breaking into a run. We sprinted down the hallway, the whispers growing into screams. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor beneath us shifted and groaned as if it might give way at any moment. We finally reached the staircase, barreling down 2 steps at a time. The air grew warmer as we descended, but the screams didn't stop. They followed us, echoing through the building, growing louder with every step. By the time we reached the front door, I felt like my chest might explode. We burst outside, gasping for air, and slammed the door shut behind us. The screams stopped instantly, replaced by the deafening silence of the night. We didn't speak as we got into the car and drove back to the station. Neither of us filed a report. What could we have said? That we were chased out of an abandoned asylum by... what? Ghosts? Demons? All I know is we weren't alone in that building, and whatever was in there, it wasn't human. I quit the force a few weeks later. I couldn't go back to Ashwood. I couldn't even drive past it without feeling that cold, suffocating fear. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping sound again, soft, deliberate, and always just outside my window.
Story number 5.
It was the kind of call no one wanted to take. Dispatch said it was a 1057, a suspicious vehicle parked on the edge of Deadwood Forest. The place was infamous around town, shrouded in rumors of disappearances, strange lights, and whispers of something darker. I'd been a cop long enough to know most of these stories were just that, stories. But this call came in at 2:30 a.m., and something about the dispatcher's tone told me it was different. I arrived on the scene, the headlights of my patrol car cutting through the dense fog that seemed to blanket the area. The vehicle was there, all right, a beat-up Chevy pickup, its engine cold, parked half in a ditch with no one inside. The driver's side door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Gripping my flashlight, I stepped out of my car. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of earth and decay. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached the truck. "Hello, police, is anyone here?" My voice felt small against the oppressive silence of the forest. No answer. I shone my flashlight into the cab. The keys were still in the ignition, a phone lay on the passenger seat, and there was a thermos with its lid off, coffee long gone cold. But no driver. I radioed in. "This is Officer Harris. I've located the vehicle, no sign of the driver. Gonna investigate further." The dispatcher's response crackled through. "Copy that, Officer Harris. Proceed with caution." I followed a trail of footprints leading away from the truck, their edges blurred by the moisture in the air. They disappeared into the tree line, where the darkness grew thicker, swallowing everything beyond the first row of trees. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to wait for backup, but something, a gut feeling maybe, pushed me forward. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, not even the distant hoot of an owl, just the sound of my breathing and the crunch of dead leaves beneath my feet. My flashlight created a narrow cone of light, illuminating gnarled tree trunks and twisted roots that seemed to claw at the ground. The footprints continued deeper into the woods, and then, abruptly, they stopped. I turned in a slow circle, sweeping my flashlight over the area. Nothing. No more prints, no broken branches, no sign of anyone or anything. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver racing down my spine. It wasn't an animal. It was too deep, too deliberate. It came from somewhere ahead, just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "If someone's out there, identify yourself." Silence, and then movement. A shadow shifted too fast and too large to be human. I raised my flashlight, but whatever it was had already vanished into the darkness. My heart pounded as I drew my gun, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't. I had to know what was out here. I moved cautiously toward where I'd seen the shadow, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The ground beneath me felt soft, spongy, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow me. The trees around me seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a person, standing still in the clearing ahead. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face... It didn't have a face. Just a smooth, blank surface that seemed to reflect the faint glow of my flashlight. It tilted its head as if studying me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, its limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking as I aimed my gun at the thing. "I'll shoot!" It didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it raised one of its long, spindly arms and pointed at me. I felt a pressure in my chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. My legs buckled, and I dropped to my knees, my gun slipping from my grip. The world around me blurred, the trees and the darkness melting into a swirling void. And then I heard them. The voices. Dozens of them, whispering, screaming, crying. They filled my head, their words indistinct but filled with terror and despair. I don't know how long I was there, trapped in that suffocating nightmare. It felt like hours, maybe days. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The pressure lifted, the voices faded, and I found myself lying on the ground, gasping for air. The thing was gone. The clearing was empty, the forest silent once more. I stumbled to my feet, my flashlight flickering weakly in my hand. I didn't care about the footprints or the truck or the missing driver anymore. I just wanted to get out. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine and peeling out of there. When I got back to the station, I told the dispatcher I'd found nothing. The truck was towed the next day, and the case was closed as a simple abandonment. No one asked any questions, and I didn't volunteer any answers. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone out there in Deadwood Forest. Something was waiting, watching, and it let me leave, for now.
Story number 6.
I wasn't even supposed to be working that night. Officer Ramirez called in sick, and I was the unlucky one to cover his shift. Graveyard shifts in our small Midwestern town were usually uneventful. Quiet roads, the occasional drunk driver, or a raccoon causing chaos in someone's trash cans. But that night was different. It started with a call just past midnight. A woman named Mrs. Calloway, an elderly recluse who lived on the outskirts of town, Reported hearing someone tapping on her windows. She sounded terrified, her voice trembling over the line. Please, come quickly, she pleaded. They're watching me. I assured her I was on my way and headed to her property. Mrs. Calloway lived in an old farmhouse surrounded by cornfields, the kind of place that felt isolated even in daylight. At night, under a shroud of darkness, it was downright eerie. As I pulled into her gravel driveway, the house loomed before me, its paint peeling and windows reflecting the moonlight like lifeless eyes. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound in the stillness. I knocked on the door. Mrs. Calloway? It's Officer Green. Are you all right? The door creaked open slightly and she peeked out, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes darted around nervously before she stepped aside to let me in. They're out there, she whispered, clutching a blanket tightly around her shoulders. I've heard them for hours. Who's out there? I asked, scanning the dimly lit room. I don't know, she said, her voice cracking, but they've been watching me. I nodded, trying to reassure her. Stay inside, lock the doors, I'll check around the property. She hesitated but nodded, closing the door behind me as I stepped out onto the porch. The night was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, pressing against your ears. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the tall, swaying cornfields that surrounded the house. I circled the property, shining my light along the windows and into the dense rows of corn. Nothing seemed out of place. No footprints, no signs of movement, just the rustle of the corn in the faint breeze. I was about to head back inside when I heard it. A faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails against glass. I turned sharply, my flashlight landing on the side of the house. The tapping stopped. Hello? I called out, my voice firm. This is the police. Show yourself. No response. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight beam danced over the wooden siding of the house, but there was no one there. Just an empty patch of grass and the shadowy edge of the cornfield. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something darted between the rows of corn, too fast for me to get a good look. My instincts kicked in, and I drew my gun, stepping cautiously toward the edge of the field. Come out where I can see you, I commanded. This is your only warning. Silence. The corn swayed gently, the stalks whispering against each other in the breeze. I stepped into the field, the tall plants towering over me, their dry leaves brushing against my uniform. The air felt heavier here, charged with an unnatural stillness. As I ventured deeper into the cornfield, the sense of being watched grew stronger. My flashlight seemed weaker, its beam barely penetrating the dense stalks. Then I heard it again, that tapping sound, this time closer, almost directly behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move on their own. My breathing quickened, and I gripped my gun tighter. Whoever's out here, you're trespassing, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Come out now, or I'll call for backup. Laughter. Low, guttural, and wrong. It didn't come from one direction. It was everywhere, echoing through the cornfield. I turned in circles, my flashlight flailing as the laughter grew louder, more distorted. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its skin was pale, almost glowing in the darkness, and its eyes, they weren't eyes, just empty, black voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't move like a person, it slithered, its body jerking and twisting in impossible ways. I froze, my body refusing to obey the primal urge to run. The thing tilted its head as if curious, and then it smiled. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The flashlight slipped from my hand, and the world seemed to tilt as the creature lunged. I stumbled backward, firing blindly into the darkness. The gunshots echoed, deafening, but the thing didn't stop. It moved faster than I could react, and before I knew it, it was gone, vanished into the shadows like it was never there. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and running back toward the house. The cornfield seemed endless, the rows twisting and stretching as if trying to trap me. When I finally burst out onto the lawn, my chest heaving, the house was dark. Mrs. Calloway, I shouted, running to the front door. It was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the house was silent. Too silent. I called her name again, stepping into the living room. The blanket she'd been clutching was on the floor, but there was no sign of her. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the house, the beam casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. I found her in the kitchen, or what was left of her. She was slumped against the wall, her eyes wide with terror and her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Long, thin scratches covered her face and arms, and her hands were clenched into fists as if she'd been fighting something off. I backed away, my stomach churning, and then I heard it again, that laughter. It echoed through the house, louder this time, more frantic. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavy and cold. I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away from that house and the nightmare that had unfolded there. When I reported the incident, they chalked it up to a wild animal attack. No one wanted to hear about the thing in the cornfield, the laughter, or the impossible smile. Mrs. Calloway's death was ruled accidental, and the case was quietly closed. But I know what I saw, and every time I drive past a cornfield now, I feel it. The weight of unseen eyes, watching, waiting. I don't work night shifts anymore. Not in that town. Not anywhere near those fields.
Story number 7.
I was working the late shift, patrolling the outskirts of a dying industrial town. The area was filled with abandoned warehouses, empty streets, and the faint smell of rust and decay. Calls out here were rare, and the nights dragged on in monotonous silence. That's why, when I got a 911 call from one of the old warehouses, my stomach tightened. The dispatcher told me the caller's voice was frantic, barely coherent. "They're inside," he'd said. "They're coming for me." Then the line went dead. I pulled up outside Warehouse 17, its hulking silhouette standing against the moonlit sky. The building was massive, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in graffiti. A single light flickered above the main entrance, casting a weak glow over the cracked concrete. I radioed in my position. "This is Officer Kane. Arrived at Warehouse 17. No sign of activity outside." "Copy that," the dispatcher replied. "Proceed with caution." I stepped out of my patrol car, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was cold and heavy, filled with the faint metallic tang of rust. The only sound was the distant hum of the wind whistling through the broken windows. The main door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. The beam of my flashlight revealed a cavernous space filled with rusted machinery, crumbling concrete, and shadows that seemed to shift as I moved. "Police!" I called out. "If anyone's in here, identify yourself." My voice echoed back to me, hollow and distorted. I moved deeper into the building, my boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The place felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl, like it was breathing, watching. Then I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping like metal on metal. It came from somewhere above me, growing louder and more deliberate. I followed the sound to a staircase, its metal steps corroded with age. The tapping stopped as I began to climb, replaced by an eerie silence. The second floor was even darker, the air colder. My flashlight flickered as I stepped into a long hallway lined with office doors, most of them hanging off their hinges. The smell of mildew was overpowering. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaking slightly. "If you need help, say something." A faint whisper answered me, so soft I almost didn't hear it. It was coming from one of the offices at the end of the hallway. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a few overturned chairs and a desk. But on the far wall, scrawled in what looked like blood, were the words, "Don't turn around." My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air pressing against my chest. Then I heard it, a faint, wet breathing directly behind me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Slowly I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Standing in the hallway was a figure. It was tall, its limbs too long, its skin pale and stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its head was tilted unnaturally to the side, and its eyes, deep, empty sockets, locked onto me. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment the thing seemed to flicker with it, like a glitch in reality. "Stay back!" I shouted, drawing my gun. "I'm warning you." It took a single step forward, its movements jerky and inhuman. Its mouth opened, impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. A low, guttural growl emanated from its throat, vibrating through the air. I fired. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse, deafening in the confined space. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't bleed. It just smiled. Panic took over, and I turned and ran. The hallway stretched endlessly, the sound of my boots pounding against the floor mixing with the creature's guttural growl. It was behind me. I could feel it, its presence suffocating, its breath cold against the back of my neck. I burst through the stairwell door and practically flew down the steps, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. When I reached the ground floor, I didn't stop. I sprinted toward the exit, the sound of the creature's pursuit growing louder, closer. I slammed into the main door and stumbled outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I turned, expecting to see the thing emerging from the darkness, but the doorway was empty. The warehouse loomed silently, its broken windows staring back like dead eyes. My radio crackled. "Officer Kane, do you copy? Are you all right?" I fumbled to grab it, my hand shaking. I'm here," I managed to choke out. "There's something in the warehouse. Something not human." There was a long pause on the other end. "Officer Kane," the dispatcher said carefully, "there haven't been any 911 calls tonight. Are you sure about your location?" "What?" I stammered. "The call came in not even 30 minutes ago. A man said they were coming for him." Another pause. Then, "Officer Kane, Warehouse 17 has been abandoned for years. No one's been in there since the 1986 incident." I didn't know what she was talking about. "What incident?" The line crackled again, her voice almost drowned out by static. In 1986, 3 officers responded to a call from Warehouse 17. All of them disappeared. When backup arrived, all they found were markings on the walls. My blood ran cold. I glanced back at the warehouse, its shadow stretching toward me as if reaching out. I didn't wait. I got into my car and drove back to the station as fast as I could, the events of that night replaying in my mind. I wanted to report it to explain what I'd seen, but what could I say? That a monster was stalking the halls of an abandoned building? That it had written warnings in blood? I didn't need to. When I returned to the station, I found a file waiting on my desk. It was old, yellowed with age, labeled Warehouse 17, 1986. Inside were photos, grainy and black and white, of the same words I'd seen on the wall. "Don't turn around." I quit the force the next day.
Story number 8.
It was a slow night at the station, one of those shifts where the clock seemed to drag just to spite you. I was going through the motions, sipping bad coffee, scanning old case files, when the call came in. The voice on the other end was male, quiet but urgent. "I need help," he said. "There's someone in my house." "What's your address, sir?" I asked, already reaching for my notepad. He gave it to me, a place on the edge of town, surrounded by woods. "Please hurry," he added, his voice breaking. I reassured him that help was on the way and drove out there. The address led me to a 2-story house that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The paint was peeling, the windows were dark, and a single porch light flickered like it could go out at any moment. I radioed my arrival. "This is Officer Marks." Arrived at the residence, proceeding to investigate. "Copy that," the dispatcher replied. "Be careful." I approached the house, scanning the area with my flashlight. The woods loomed around it like a fortress, the trees swaying in the wind. Something about the place felt wrong, like the air was thicker here, heavier. The door was unlocked, creaking open as I pushed it. "Police!" I called out, stepping inside. The house was dimly lit, the air stale and cold. "Sir? Are you here?" No response. I moved through the house, my flashlight illuminating worn furniture, faded wallpaper, and dusty shelves. There were signs of life, dishes in the sink, a jacket draped over a chair, but no sign of the man who'd called. Then I heard it, a faint creak from upstairs. My hand instinctively went to my holster as I moved toward the staircase. The steps groaned under my weight as I climbed, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. "Sir, if you're up there, I need you to answer me," I said, my voice firm. The second floor was darker, the narrow hallway stretching into shadow. I checked each room, empty bedroom, cluttered office, unused guest room, until only one door remained. It was slightly ajar and a faint light flickered inside. I pushed it open. The room was small, with a single bed against the wall and a window that overlooked the woods. A lamp on the bedside table cast a dim yellow glow, but the room was empty, no sign of the caller. Then I saw it. On the wall, written in what looked like charcoal, were the words, "He's in the woods." My breath hitched. The handwriting was jagged, desperate, as if scrawled in a hurry. I backed out of the room, my flashlight sweeping the hallway, my hand tightening on my gun. Something moved outside. A shadow darted past the window, quick and deliberate. I rushed downstairs, my boots pounding against the floorboards, and flung open the front door. The woods stood before me, dark and impenetrable. My flashlight barely pierced the canopy of trees. "Sir!" I shouted, stepping off the porch. "If you're out there, make yourself known." No answer. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to wait for backup. but something, maybe pride, maybe stupidity, pushed me forward. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I entered the woods, the air growing colder with each step. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at the sky. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying faint, indistinct sounds that could have been voices. I followed a narrow path, my flashlight revealing broken twigs and disturbed patches of earth. Then I found him. He was standing in a clearing, his back to me. He was tall, wearing a tattered coat that swayed in the breeze. His head hung low and his hands were at his sides. "Sir?" I called, approaching cautiously. "Are you all right?" He didn't move. "Sir, I'm here to help," I said, my voice softer now. "But I need you to turn around." Slowly he did, and I wish he hadn't. His face, if you could call it that, was a twisted, pulsating mass of flesh and shadow. Eyes blinked in places they shouldn't, and a gaping mouth stretched across where his chin should have been. He grinned, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I stumbled back, my flashlight dropping to the ground. My heart pounded as the thing took a step toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. A low, guttural growl emanated from its throat, sending a chill down my spine. I drew my gun, aiming it at the creature. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. It lunged. I fired. The gunshots echoed through the woods, but the creature didn't stop. It twisted and contorted, moving in ways that no living thing should. I turned and ran, the flashlight beam swinging wildly as I sprinted through the trees. The path seemed to stretch endlessly, the woods warping and shifting around me. I could hear it behind me, its guttural growls, its distorted laughter. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened, swallowing the faint light of my flashlight. Finally, I broke through the tree line, the house coming into view. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against the wall, my gun still clutched in my hand. Then I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my head. The creature was there, its face pressed against the glass. Its grin widened as it raised a hand and pointed at me. I ran out the back door, into my car, and peeled out of the driveway without looking back. The creature didn't follow, at least, not that I saw. When I got back to the station, I filed my report, leaving out the part about the creature. No one would believe me, and even if they did, what could they do? I never went back to that house, and as far as I know, it still stands there, empty and waiting. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear tapping on my windows, and I don't turn around.
Story number 9.
It was a cold October night when I got the call. I was just finishing my shift, eager to get home, when the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Officer Torres, we've got a 911 call from the old Maplewood orphanage. Caller reported strange noises inside the building. You're the closest unit. Can you check it out?" The orphanage had been abandoned for over 20 years. A hulking, decrepit building on the outskirts of town. It had a reputation, a magnet for ghost stories and teenage dares. Most locals stayed away, and for good reason. The place was a ruin, dark and foreboding, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. I sighed, grabbed my flashlight and responded, "On my way." As I pulled up, the building loomed in the darkness, its Gothic spires cutting against the moonlit sky. The iron gates were slightly ajar, creaking as the wind pushed them back and forth. I parked my car and stepped out, my breath fogging in the cold night air. "Dispatch, this is Torres. Arrived at Maplewood, proceeding to investigate." "Copy that. Be careful." I approached the front door, its wood warped and splintered from years of neglect. It opened with a groan, revealing a vast, dark foyer. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and decay. "Police," I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. "Is anyone here?" No response. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing crumbling plaster, graffiti-covered walls, and scattered debris. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. I moved deeper into the orphanage, my footsteps crunching on broken glass and old tiles. The stories about this place flickered in my mind. Tales of children who vanished, of cruel caretakers, of whispers in the dark. I'd always dismissed them as urban legends, but standing there in the heart of the building, I wasn't so sure anymore. As I entered what looked like an old dining hall, I heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle. I froze, the sound sending a chill down my spine. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "If someone's here, come out, you're trespassing." The giggle came again, this time from the far end of the hall. I swung my flashlight in that direction, illuminating a doorway that led to a narrow corridor. The sound of footsteps, light and rapid, echoed down the hall. "Stop!" I shouted, drawing my gun. "Show yourself!" I moved cautiously toward the corridor, my heart pounding. The hallway was lined with doors, most of them hanging off their hinges. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. At the end of the corridor was a door slightly ajar. From behind it, I could hear faint whispers, multiple voices overlapping and indistinct. I pushed the door open, revealing a large playroom. The room was in disarray, filled with broken toys, overturned furniture, and scattered papers. But what caught my attention was the writing on the walls, scrawled in what looked like black ink. "We never left." The whispers stopped. The air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned, scanning the room, and that's when I saw them. Children. Dozens of them, standing in the shadows, their faces pale and gaunt. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, and their expressions were void of emotion. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stared. "Are you all right?" I asked, though my voice was barely more than a whisper. One of them stepped forward, a girl with long dark hair and a tattered dress. She raised her hand and pointed at me. "They're coming," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Who's coming?" I asked, but before she could answer, the room plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me blind in the pitch black. The whispers returned, louder now, more frantic. I felt a presence around me, the air growing colder with each passing second. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep and menacing. I fumbled with my flashlight, smacking it against my hand until it flickered back to life. The beam illuminated the room, but the children were gone. Instead, something else stood in their place. It was tall, hunched, and grotesque. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skeletal frame, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. Its mouth was a gaping maw filled with sharp, uneven teeth, and its hands ended in long, claw-like fingers. The creature let out a deafening roar and lunged toward me. I fired my gun, the shots echoing through the orphanage, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. I turned and ran, my flashlight bobbing wildly as I sprinted down the hall. The building seemed to shift around me, the hallways twisting and stretching. Doors appeared where they hadn't been before, and familiar paths led to dead ends. The whispers grew louder, blending with the creature's guttural growls. Finally, I found the front door. I burst through it, stumbling into the cold night air. Behind me, the orphanage stood silent and still, as if mocking me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. I locked the doors, my hands trembling as I grabbed the radio. "Dispatch," I gasped. "This is Torres. There's something in that orphanage. Something not human." There was silence on the other end, and then the dispatcher's voice came through, confused. "Torres, are you sure about your location? There haven't been any 911 calls from Maplewood tonight." I stared at the building, my heart sinking. "What are you talking about? I got the call less than an hour ago." "Officer Torres," she said hesitantly, "Maplewood has been condemned for years. The phone lines don't even work." I didn't reply. I just sat there, staring at the orphanage, my mind racing. I left the force not long after that. Whatever I encountered that night wasn't something I could explain, let alone fight. But sometimes when I drive past the old orphanage, I swear I see faces in the windows, and I can still hear the whispers.
Story number 10.
I always thought safety was something you could count on. You follow the rules, keep your head down, and bad things don't happen to you. At least that's what I believed until the night that shattered my sense of security forever. It started like any other evening. I had just finished a late shift at the diner. It was around 11 p.m., and the streets were eerily quiet as I walked home. The air felt heavy like it does before a storm, but the skies were clear. I remember glancing at my watch when I first heard the faint sound of a car engine trailing behind me. A police cruiser pulled up slowly alongside me. The officer rolled down the window, his face shadowed by the dim streetlights. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice deep but with an odd edge, like he wasn't entirely sure how to ask the question. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual, though my heart began to race. "Just heading home." "You live around here?" he pressed. I nodded, giving him the street name but not my exact address. Something about his gaze, sharp and probing, made me uneasy. "Well," he said after a pause, "it's not safe to be walking alone this late. Hop in, I'll give you a ride." I hesitated. His uniform was clean, his badge glinting in the pale light, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered on me, or the fact that he didn't look like any of the officers I'd seen patrolling this area before. "No, thank you," I said, forcing a polite smile. "I'm almost home." He didn't move the car. Instead, he stared at me for what felt like an eternity. "You sure about that? A lot of bad things happen around here at night." That's when I felt it, a chill running down my spine, like a warning I couldn't explain. "I'm fine," I said firmly, picking up my pace. The cruiser didn't follow me, at least not immediately. It stayed parked for a moment before the engine revved and it drove off down the road. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. 2 blocks later, I heard the engine again. This time, it was behind me. The same cruiser, creeping closer, its headlights off. Panic gripped me. I ducked into an alley, hoping to lose him. My heart pounded in my chest as I weaved through the narrow passageways, taking random turns until I was sure I'd lost him. When I finally emerged onto another street, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I saw the cruiser parked at the corner, its lights still off. How did he know where I'd come out? I turned and ran, no longer caring about staying calm. My legs burned, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop until I reached my apartment building. I darted inside, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. For a moment, I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing. I felt a flicker of relief, until I heard the sound of heavy boots on the stairs outside. My blood turned to ice. I peeked through the peephole and saw him, the officer. Only now, he wasn't wearing his hat, and his face was twisted into something almost inhuman. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim hallway light, and his grin was unnaturally wide, showing teeth that were far too sharp. I backed away, my mind racing. Was he even human? The door rattled as he tried the handle. "Open up," he said, his voice distorted like it was coming from multiple directions at once. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling. 911, what's your emergency?" A calm voice answered. "There's an officer outside my door," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "He followed me home, and he's trying to get in." "An officer?" the dispatcher asked, her tone suddenly cautious. "Do you know his name or badge number?" "No," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But he's not normal. Please send someone quickly." There was a pause on the line. "Ma'am, we don't have any officers patrolling your area tonight." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What?" "I'm dispatching a unit to your location now. Stay on the line." But before she could say anything else, the call cut off. My phone screen went black, even though the battery had been nearly full. The doorknob stopped rattling. Silence filled the apartment. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. Then, suddenly a loud bang shook the door. I screamed, stumbling backward. The banging continued, each impact making the door shudder. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. I waited, heart pounding, for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, I gathered the courage to look through the peephole again. The hallway was empty. The sound of distant sirens broke the eerie silence. Moments later, real police officers arrived. They searched the building and the surrounding area, but found no sign of the man or his cruiser. When I described him, one of the officers went pale. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. "Is this him?" he asked. My stomach dropped. It was the same man. "That's Officer Harris," the officer said grimly. "He died in the line of duty 5 years ago." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I moved out of that apartment the very next day. I never walked home alone at night again. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I catch glimpses of a police cruiser in my rearview mirror. It always disappears when I try to get a better look, and every time I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for his next victim.
Story number 11.
I've always been a night owl, the kind of person who finds comfort in the quiet hours when most of the world is asleep. That's why working the graveyard shift at the gas station didn't bother me, at least not until last month. The station was in the middle of nowhere, a lonely outpost surrounded by miles of dense woods. Most nights, I'd pass the time scrolling through my phone, sipping bad coffee, and waiting for the occasional trucker to roll in for fuel. It was boring, sure, but uneventful. Then came the night that changed everything. It was close to 3 a.m. when a police cruiser pulled into the lot. I remember thinking how strange it was. I hadn't seen a cop out here in weeks. The cruiser parked by the pump, but no one got out. I waited, expecting the officer to come inside, but the car just sat there, engine idling. The windows were too tinted to see inside, but I could make out a figure in the driver's seat. After a few minutes, I decided to step outside. Maybe they needed help. As I approached the car, the engine suddenly shut off and the headlights flickered, casting the gas station in strange, shifting shadows. "Everything okay?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. I moved closer, squinting to see through the window. The figure inside sat perfectly still, hands on the wheel, head tilted slightly downward as if they were staring at something in their lap. "Sir?" I said, knocking lightly on the glass. The figure slowly turned its head toward me. That's when I noticed something was wrong. The face staring back at me wasn't right. Its features were distorted, stretched like someone had taken a human face and twisted it into something grotesque. The eyes were too large, glowing faintly in the dim light, and the mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, teeth impossibly sharp and too many to count. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The figure didn't move. It just stared, its grin growing wider. I bolted back inside the station, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I grabbed the phone to call the police. 911, what's your emergency? "There's someone here," I stammered. "In a police cruiser. They're not normal." The dispatcher's voice remained calm, but there was an edge of concern. "Can you describe them?" I tried, but my words felt inadequate. "Stay inside," she said. "We're sending an officer to your location." I hung up and glanced out the window. The cruiser was still there, but now the figure was standing outside the car, motionless, facing the gas station. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The fluorescent lights of the station flickered, casting the figure in brief moments of darkness. Each time the light came back on, it seemed to be closer, though I never saw it move. I grabbed a wrench from under the counter, clutching it like a lifeline. The air inside the station felt heavy, suffocating, and a strange static hum filled my ears. Then the lights went out completely. Panic set in as I fumbled in the dark, using my phone's flashlight to navigate. I pointed it toward the window and screamed. The figure was pressed against the glass, its face mere inches from mine. It didn't knock or try to get in. It just stared, its grin impossibly wide, its eyes glowing like embers. I backed away, tripping over a display rack and landing hard on the floor. The glass rattled as the figure began tapping on it, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo in my skull. "Help is on the way," I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the door to the gas station creaked open. I knew I had locked it. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it toward the entrance. The door was ajar, swinging gently as if pushed by an unseen hand. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice betrayed my fear. The figure stepped inside. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it didn't quite know how to walk. It didn't speak or make any sound, but its grin never wavered. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the wrench tightly. "What do you want?" I demanded. It tilted its head again as if considering my question. Then, in a voice that sounded like a chorus of whispers layered over static, it said, "You called for help." Before I could react, the sound of distant sirens broke through the heavy silence. The figure froze, its grin faltering for the first time. The lights flickered back on, and in that brief moment of brightness, the figure vanished. The police arrived moments later, finding me trembling behind the counter. I tried to explain what had happened, but my story sounded insane even to me. They found no trace of the cruiser or the figure I'd seen, but one of the officers, a grizzled man with tired eyes, pulled me aside. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "We've had calls like this before, all from people out here late at night. Whatever you saw, it's not something we can explain." He handed me a card with his number on it. "If it happens again, call me directly, and don't work alone at night anymore." I quit my job the next day, but even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I see headlights in my rearview mirror. They follow me for miles before vanishing without a trace. And every time I hear that slow, deliberate tapping in my dreams.